All right, we are live. So welcome anyone tuning in. My name is Allie. I am the Associate Director for Abundance, North Carolina. Welcome to our 5th annual Death Fair. We are welcoming Dr. Tashel Bordere all the way in Missouri. So welcome to Abundance's Death Fair. So I'm going to introduce her. So Tashel C. Bordere, PhD, CT, is an Assistant Professor of Human Development and Family Science and State Extension Specialist in Youth Development at the University of Missouri-Columbia. She has served as board member of the Association for Death Education and Counseling and editor of the ADEC Forum. Dr. Bordere is a Forward Promise Fellow and received the Ronald K. Barrett National Award from ADEC for her research and public scholarship on bereaved Black youth and young adults. Her research focuses on diversity and resilience through loss, including a co-edited, co-authored book, Handbook of Social Justice in Loss and Grief. She has done trainings across the country and has been featured on multiple NPR broadcasts, Grief Out Loud podcast, Legacy.com, and national and international webcasts. National Alliance for Grieving Children. Alrighty. So Dr. Bordere will present her keynote and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I will first thank you, Dr. Bordere, for being here, but I will let you go ahead and take it from here.
All right, thank you so much for your introduction, Allie. Today, our 3-year-old will be making the tough decision about which Paw Patrol mask and costume she'll be wearing this afternoon. Our 14-year-old, well, as they do, at the last minute asked me to run out and get t-shirts of 2 different colors for her and her friend. She and her friend, you see, will look and appear to be themselves, wearing only t-shirts of different colors, matching characters of a popular video game, it turns out. So they're much more sophisticated as teens. They will look like themselves and essentially be masked in plain sight. With the COVID-19 pandemic, for our physical safety, we wear and are adorned in masks on a daily basis. Masks conveying different messages, some representing our ideologies. I can't breathe, love wins, hug trees. But then there are many other masks, visible and invisible masks, concealing our anxieties, our fears and worries, our sadness, frustrations, our anger, and distress amid so much ambiguity and uncertainty. And isn't that the way it is with grief and loss? Something we deal with oftentimes and are all experiencing right now to some extent, where we're in a position of making the tough decisions about how we will show up in the world while dealing with some of the greatest, most overwhelming, painful moments and experiences of our lives. Many bereaved people, some of whom are here today. I know you're here for a death fair, and some of you knew what to expect and some of you didn't. But either way, some of you who are here today wake up and have moved throughout your days having to decide, like many people, which mask you will wear, which feelings you'll need to conceal just to get through the day. To get through the workday, to teach and captivate kids both online and in seat, to parent your teen, to grandparent, to be supportive partners in a broader culture that leaves little room for grace, for showing up as ourselves, in spaces where compassionate support is accessible for bereaved people, young and older, in a society that really struggles with how to support bereaved people, younger and older, struggles with what to say, how to help, how to support people who are dealing with loss, death and non-death losses. And some people, and again, some people right out there in the room, I'm not physically there with you, but I'm here with you. I'm here with you in spirit and across the miles, right? Some of you may also identify with the idea that you may have even dealt with penalties or suffocated grief at your hardest times of loss and non-death loss in environments that should otherwise be providing support to you. I am Dr. Tashel Bordere, grief specialist, professor, and researcher at the University of Missouri. And it really is, and I'm also a New Orleans native. I always like to say that, hence my purple, green, and gold. Um, it is really an honor to be here with you today. I hope that you're able to take advantage of the time and connection and learning and sharing in this really creative and supportive space provided for you here today at this year's Death Fair, focused on death and particularly non-death losses, right? Non-death losses that really are also sources of grief for people, significantly impacting families, but that are less often addressed from a grief and loss perspective. In particular, the Black Lives Matter movement and losses that are represented in that social movement, the COVID-19 pandemic, and losses occurring in our natural environment that we're witnessing. What I'm here to talk to you today about are the losses that not only go unrecognized, which we can all identify with. We've all had a loss and shown back up to work, or or gotten on a Zoom call recently when it was really tough because you're also trying to help your child out with homework. And now society has moved on, right? As if we're not in a pandemic, and expecting you to still show the same level of productivity, for your children to still show up for exams promptly and timely, right? Because we are in a position of moving about our society as if these things haven't happened, right? There was much more compassion, if you all could think about it, maybe in the spring, a tiny bit in the summer, but a lot of that has waned now as we are now in the fall semester. We're in a new season. And in fact, we know how much society, evidence of how much society wants us to just move quickly past our loss experiences and our grief is even the notion of holiday shifts in stores, right? I was shopping, looking around at some holiday items, or I guess Halloween. Some people celebrate it and some don't, but I was looking around at some of the things. And at least 2 weeks ago, they were already moving away the Halloween items and putting up, Christmas and Hanukkah items and some Kwanzaa items. While all of that is cool, we haven't even gotten to Halloween yet, right? For people who celebrate it. And we've already moved on. In stores, right? And these social environments around us tend to be our mirrors for how we should be feeling, right? How we get to feel, when we get to celebrate, when we get to feel sad, right? So much more that we think is in our control really is not. It's controlled by all of these forces and systems around us that functions as mirrors for how we should be functioning, how we should be, and which losses should matter, right? Whose lives and whose deaths should matter and count, right? Non-death losses in particular garner even less support. So again, what I'm here to talk to you about are the losses that not only go unrecognized, and again, non-death losses like COVID, and the loss that people are feeling around not having as much physical contact with others. For some, is really some people really don't value your sense of loss or grief. I'm thinking right now about people in the audience who may not be thinking about, they're extroverts, for example. So I really want us to think broadly in this space right now. This won't be a discussion on depression, although loss can be really challenging. I want us to think right now in our time together about, the losses that you are getting some space to think about at this death fair, right? Which they're really profound. It's profound that they're putting on this space for you all, because it really is important to get exposure if you're not dealing with grief around these, but to think about it. You might find in our time today that you actually are experiencing grief around some of these. We just have not called it that. because society has not given you license to do so. And today in this space, I'm giving you license to do so. This death fair is giving you license to think about for yourselves, hey, I actually am grieving somewhat. Grieving is not a bad word. In fact, let's all say it in our minds. Grief. I'm grieving. I miss my grandmother who I have not seen, who lives miles away and I can't travel to see, right? Or you miss being physically in your classroom for the teens who are there today, right? Or you're there, but it's not in the same way, despite everybody working their hardest and doing their best. We are really in a really difficult time of ambiguous losses that really don't have an endpoint. And when that happens, we are at a greater disadvantage in terms of coping. It's really harder to cope when we don't know when something is going to end, right? And also, it's difficult to cope when something feels forever, as in a death loss, right? Death of a human being, death of a pet. Um, right now, you are in the company of people who hopefully will feel supportive of you and where you have a safe space to think about these different issues, right? Um, and so, again, I want to talk about today with us um, those losses that are not only unrecognized in our culture, but that are often penalized. And I want us to think about those. Again, I'm here to talk about the urgent issue of experiencing suffocated grief, or the consequences that grieving people experience. Again, some of you here today. Or you may, if you don't feel like it's you, you probably know of someone, or have seen even on TV the grief of people in social media who are being penalized and punished for normal grief reactions to disenfranchising losses through violence and inequities. Um, uh, some with law enforcement, some in communities, right? It doesn't really matter who the perpetrator, who the offender is. These losses can still just be challenging. I also want to highlight that there are wonderful people in every profession. Just so that we're clear, I know we all get kind of sensitive because I talk about sensitive issues. I like to just say that there are many wonderful people in every profession, and then there are people who consciously or unconsciously do things that are harmful for others. We all participate in that at times. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. So we want to think about the ways in which people get penalized for normal grief reactions. And some of those non-death losses might be related to grief expressed in protests due to inequities and violence. And hence we have the Black Lives Matter movement. You might notice sometimes whether or not you experience this, but part of our time together really is how we can be allies for people and advocate for people who are dealing with these challenging losses, so that everybody is living in and is nobody's grief is being disenfranchised, nobody's grief is being suffocated or penalized, simply because we don't understand it or we don't value it. So some examples of that might be people who are grieving behaviorally. I want to also clarify that when we grieve, it's not always is expressed emotionally, right? I want everybody to think right now about so many other ways in which we express grief that perhaps you have even been expressing it, right? Any of you felt more? Have any of you out there felt more tired than normal, right? To so many Zoom meetings, you feel much more exhausted than you would have been if you were face to face at a meeting. That's a real thing. It's a thing. Zoom exhaustion, right? We have to show up in this way that is not representative of who we are. We have to be staring at the computer and things like that. And it really produces significant fatigue. There's grief around not being places. My teenager has even said, wow, at least last spring, this fall, she's kind of getting used to being home, right? She's adjusted. But at least this spring, she thought, I never thought I'd say this, but I kind of want to go back to school, right? And so there was real grief around, you know, some decisions that are really central right now to keep people safe, but that we mourn nonetheless, right? It is okay to grieve these things, and to be supported in it. Many teens, for example, have been, critiqued for feeling like they are sad about missing a prom or a graduation. Well, those are significant developmental milestones, and those experiences of grief count, and we don't want to minimize those. or critique or penalize our youth for having these different feelings, right? Because they're normal and natural. You can experience disappointment and understand a reason for something at the same time. Those feelings can coexist. So they're not being selfish. It is a normal grief react. It's normal to feel sad about something that you look forward to, and even more so that is ambiguous. You don't even know what's going to be, what else you might miss out on, right? Some experiences can't be redone. We're in a place of new normal, and it is okay. So I'm reassuring you, parents, caregivers, grandparents, educators, it is okay to be supportive and acknowledge those losses. They're important to you, the functioning of your kids. So in any case, so people at protests, I want to come back to that since Black Lives Matter is being addressed, and thank you for doing that and being courageous and setting up a space for people to think about that. People of all backgrounds, right, are important in this. It's called Black Lives Matter, but everybody's participation really is central. In fact, allies are even more central in enfranchising the grief of people who are dealing with that, this profound grief. You might notice at protests that people who are protesting and expressing their grief behaviorally. So I'm coming back to that. Grief is expressed through tears emotionally, but grief is expressed in so many other ways, as I was saying, through feeling fatigued, through feeling eating more, or eating less, right? Some of you are having your Haagen-Dazs every night, right? If you're like me, a Bluebell, okay? As a form of, I'm enjoying myself, but it's not something that is going to serve me the best, right? So, eating, being more irritable, right? Being more irritable, buying things we can't afford right now, right? Making big decisions that we would never make. All of these are expressions of working more, working less, right? Some of you may wake up and you're usually flowing, but since the pandemic has started, you really feel less productive despite your best efforts, right? Despite your most sincere energies, you just are not able to complete things the same way that you had been doing. I also have experienced that. Although I study grief and loss, it's been challenging, even for me as an expert in this area, to do some of the work that I've been trying to do. So it happens to all of us. It's normal, right? Um, so you may have noticed at protests where people are trying to express their grief behaviorally. Losses due to violence can be there's a lot of stigma around losses due to violence, no matter who committed the act of murder or whatever it is we want to call it. There's a lot of stigma around it, so it's difficult. People don't want to talk about it. People are less likely to ask you about your loss. And people are also much more likely to judge you, to question, what did this person do then to deserve it? Again, it doesn't matter if it's in a community or due to some other race-based form of violence. There's a lot of stigma around the perpetrator. The perpetrator is criminalized. Children go back to school, and they're less likely to tell their teachers. People are less likely to tell their coworkers. And so the Black Lives Matter movement is important, and really trying to say these lives matter and they count. Even if people in society are trying to criminalize them or devalue them, they count. And either the case, it does either way, the person's life matters. Right? It's still somebody's child who died, somebody's nephew, their brother, their father, and that is a source of grief for people. You might notice at the protest that people who are simply behaviorally expressing their grief by walking along a path may be tear gassed, right? Or it's one thing for somebody to walk by you and say, I don't care that you're grieving. It's another thing for people to throw tear gas at you for just simply walking down the street to express that this life mattered and it counted. And to want to do that publicly in a culture that is much more likely to say, go do that in private. That life didn't matter, right? And so that's really the purpose of it. And so suffocated grief is when people are actively penalized for it. Suffocated grief is where children who return to classes right now, and you return to work right now, but you're concerned about your parent or grandparent who is in the hospital with COVID, right? Or you've dealt with a COVID death. People around you may or may not understand, even in your workplaces, that you are grieving this loss. There are children who are grieving the loss because it's so visible, like Black Lives Matter. And it's important that it's visible, but because it's visible, you have children who really are worrying whether they're talking about it or not. They're grieving, the potential death of a grandparent because they're watching so many people die who are older. You have people who are having to return to work and who are returning to work, whether they choose to or not, and children who are returning to school, um, virtually or in person, who are being penalized for normal grief reactions in terms of productivity. Children are distracted right now. Some of you are distracted right now, and you may be penalized. Children may be penalized for normal grief reactions, just like adults, for not being productive enough, right? Again, we live in a society where we're supposed to, get beyond grief in 3 days and get back to work in a capitalistic society that values money and values products, right? And so the experience of suffocated grief might come in the form of a child being suspended or expelled for simply being distracted, right? Or being sent out of the room because they're not paying attention. But it's hard to pay attention when you know about a cared about person in your neighborhood who was murdered, right? Or you've had a grandparent to die. My own brother was on a ventilator with COVID, right? And we waited 5 days, 7 days with him on a ventilator, wondering if he was going to live or not. I was not productive during that time period, except for numerous calls to the hospital. Okay, hoping to get information at a really difficult time. Doctors are not available to give that much information, and so I could have been penalized at work or in other spaces. Fortunately, I had support. Not everybody's so fortunate, so it can really be difficult. To deal with those. With COVID, we've experienced the loss of cared about persons, loss of time with cared about persons. Some people have been experiencing distance from grandparents while we're trying to keep them safe. And in our environment, which gets so much less attention, is also a major source of loss, right? We're watching wildfires happen. We're watching so many other environmental shifts that are happening that are real sources of loss that are extremely devalued in our culture, right? And so what I'm here to emphasize to you today is that it matters. Your loss counts. Your loss, it is not okay for your loss to be penalized in our culture. And so part of our time today, again, is to take advantage of this space at this death fair to be able to, and if you're not able to physically be at the death fair, I want you to imagine in your own home, right? In your own space, an altar set up, right? And they'll talk much more about this, but in our call, I want you to think about that your grief matters. And I want you to envision, even if you can't be physically at the death fair, that you can still participate, right? I want to leave you with some ways to be able to create your own healing spaces in a culture that may not acknowledge your grief, and in fact that may suffocate it by trying to penalize you, right? For your own safety and your own well-being and your own rights at grieving. Much like this death fair, I want you to imagine if you're dealing with losses and stresses due to pervasive racism, sexism, ageism. I want you to imagine an altar for yourself where you know have a space for yourself to acknowledge how hard it is for you today, to take some time for yourself to create your own collage related to this movement, related to your own feelings, your own struggles, your own grief, your own healing, what you're doing to take care of yourself, right? To make a note of it. The same is the case with COVID. Like, what are your fears? What are your worries? Also, what are the sources that you perceive of support? There are so many first responders around there, not just the physicians, but you as a parent, you're a first responder. Our teachers, they're first responders, our clergy members. Like, who are your sources of support? Write them down. Put them in your space, in your workspace, your other space. And then the environment, right? And many people are grieving all of these at the same time, and you're experiencing much more complicated cases of loss. And there might be even more trauma for you. So your environmental space, right? What are you grieving about the environment? What are your fears? What are your worries? What are your anxieties? And if it's not safe to express those at work, if it's not safe to express those, even among family members, you still get to create your own space, whether you're 5 or 15 or 35 or 50 or 85, 105, right? We're living longer these days. You can still create your space that matches what has been created here at this death fair, and you still are part of today and days beyond this, right? Much when this fair is over, you still get to do that. So finally, how do we heal ourselves, and then how do we function as advocates for people who are dealing with non-death losses and death losses that have been disenfranchised, and where you have watched people around you, your friends who may be a part of the Black Lives Movement or who identify with it, right? Um, or who you are worried about. Um, COVID, right, is a fear for many people. It's a worry for many people. And even if it's not a worry for you, there are other people out there who are worried, right? We're all in this same fabric. And where one group is dealing with oppression and loss, ultimately we all will be dealing with it at some point. So when the environment is safe for all, for everybody, then we are all better positioned to be productive and healthy, and really a functioning society and community. Um, how do we use our strength? Some people are like, I don't know what to do. I feel bad when I watch it on television, right? But I don't know what to do. So how do we take our well intentions and how do we shift from our well intentions to actually serving an advocacy role, a functional role for other people? We take our power, we take our social power, our political power, our economic power, and we can facilitate change in those ways. One way that I do it is through trying to provide education and experiences such as this. The people who have created the death fair for you, they are also being advocates, whether or not they're dealing with COVID, whether or not they are Black or a part of the Black Lives Movement, right? Um, we're all in this together. And so one way that they're advocating and using their power, right, is through this death fair. So I want everybody to think about two things right now. Three things. What is your own experience with loss today, whether it's through any of these experiences or not? What are you seeing in your environment when you're paying attention to social media and to the news? Even if you're not experiencing it, you're watching people be in pain. They're not making that up. There's nothing worse than dealing with the loss and the person doesn't believe you, right? So how might you be conduits of change? We don't lose out by helping other people. We gain. Um, so how do we form alliances with other people in this challenging time and beyond? We figure out what our strengths are and we put them into practice, whether it's donating time, donating funds, um, simply telling when a person, here's a huge way though, you all, when a person says that they are dealing with something that is hard, believe them. That is one of the best ways that we can ever advocate for people who are dealing with loss in a bigger society that often will not acknowledge it, will sometimes even penalize it, is to say, I see you. So right now I say to each of you participating at that death fair, and to those who organized it, they could have done anything else with this death fair, right? But they were paying attention and they chose to focus on some of the biggest issues and sources of grief for the communities at large, nationally and internationally, through this death fair. What will you do? You will see the person, you will hear the person, we will listen more than we talk. Most bereaved people, as I wrap up, are not looking for advice. They're not looking for us to tell a longer story than they just told us. They're looking for a listening, active listening, compassionate ear. They're looking for someone to validate the experience they've just had, the experience you've seen them have, or the experience they've just had. So I see you, I hear you, I feel you. Let's all think about that right now. And if you need to tell that, some of you need to tell it to your partner right now. Some of you need to turn to your child right now, or your parent, or even your pet when you get home. I see you and I hear you. Your loss matters. Your grief matters. Thank you. You matter. You matter. We will get through this challenging time. Again, I'm Dr. Bordere, grief specialist, professor researcher, studying violent losses and traumatic loss. And I'm so glad to be here with you. And coping, how do we get through it? Glad to be here with you today. Thank you for this opportunity.
All right, so we are gonna open up. Some people have been sending in to me while you've been speaking. And so I know you mentioned, this first question says, how do we support each other in our different griefs? It's confusing because everyone is so different, and you did just mention about how just believing them, but if you happen to have any other tips, that would be our first question.
Sure. Yeah. One thing is to recognize the thank you for your question and for being here. One of the things, if I knew your name, I'd send a shout out. But in any case, I see you kind of through the screen. I acknowledge your humanness and your presence. One thing is first to recognize that there is no one right or wrong correct way to grieve, right? We tend to, again, think about it as tears. But one thing is to not have expectations for other people, right? Kubler-Ross, I'll say this for example, her theory about the stages of grief, Kubler-Ross came up with this theory that we all go through stages. And I want to highlight and say this very clearly right now, that we actually do not go through stages of grief. We may experience any of those. We may experience denial for our own protection, right? We may experience, and even that's not a negative thing, right? Denial really means that sometimes our bodies physically can't deal with something in a moment. And so it's a protective function. The person knows that somebody has died or is dying. It's just emotionally safe for them to move throughout, navigate a situation in the way that they are at the time. And not trying to put timelines on people's grief, right? But knowing that everybody has their own process, because we all have different brains. And we all express things differently. Some people have stomach aches, right? How many of you have stomach aches when you're anxious about something? Or you're dealing with something hard? Or headaches, right? That we might not call grief. One thing is to notice that there is no one right or wrong way to grieve. There are really probably 100 different ways or more that grief can be expressed. But to be patient with people, right? Being patient. Sometimes I say that, I hold the light for people when they can't hold it for themselves, right? Just don't have the energy. Grief takes so much. It takes exorbitant amounts of brain power and energy to grieve. Our brains understand that we're going through something really hard, that we're experiencing separation distress, right? From a very significant person or about a very significant event or lifetime experience. And one thing I did mention is I also want to mention, debilitating injuries that are not visible for people, brain injuries, experiences like sexual assault. All of those can cause a sense of grief for people. And to be patient with how people are expressing their grief, because it works for them. Is getting them through this moment right now. For some people, working more is getting them through it, right? And we don't want to say stop working as much, right? But we want to just simply acknowledge that they're grieving, that their grief matters, and that they are holding it. You are holding it, quietly. You're offering human presence, and you're holding a light. Maybe you're holding it behind you. I like to think of as this light I hold for grieving people, and just wait with them through the journey. You can also support grieving people by providing consistent, tangible support and following through on it. So, for our teenager who was who was very patient and wonderful throughout COVID. She was a great source of help with our 3-year-old. I'm working from home, and my partner's an ICU physician working with COVID patients. I study grief and loss. Our lives have been really challenged. We're first responders, both of us. So for a teenager who has been so patient, some things that I did to support her was I acknowledged that this is really hard. When she, was upset about being so far away from her friends and not having as much time, I acknowledged that her friends matter, that her eighth grade graduation that she didn't get to have mattered, right? So acknowledging that these things that are important for a person matter, even if we don't see it that way. If it matters to them, it matters. That's all that counts. We arranged a little spa day for her. Well, on every step, I literally made these little signs, and these will work out with your sweetie pies too, by the way, y'all, as well as your kids. I made these little signs with crayons for my 3-year-old on colored sheets of paper, and on each step, I wrote something like, COVID really sucks. On the first thing, right? The second, where she walked on the next step, it said something like, it's hard to be away from your friends. Time away from your friends matter. On each step, I wrote, your eighth grade graduation matters. As she went down, the next step I had something like, thank you for doing your best. Know that people who are grieving are doing their best and acknowledging it. Again, with free of advice about how they should or should not be feeling, what they should or should not be doing, they're doing their best. And so that just acknowledging her grief, acknowledging her sense of loss, death and non-death loss,
Okay.
was extremely helpful for her.
And our next question that we have is, what is a way to figure out my suffocated grief and losses that I'm grieving without it being evident, like the death is evident?
Okay. So I guess I want to thank you also for your question. I see you. I hear you. What are some ways that is she wanting? I guess I'm not fully understanding. Is she trying to think about how her or his grief is? I know you don't have that much information in front of you. How the grief is being? How can she conceal it? Is she wanting to
She is trying to figure out the suffocated grief and losses. I'm guessing she's asking, how do you figure out what parts of your grief are suffocated? I'm guessing.
Yes. Yeah, well, I will do my best to answer your question, and thank you. Sometimes we're trying to figure it out. Some people have, the concept of suffocated grief was developed through my work with grieving teens, who were again being penalized. Suffocated grief is really when you're being penalized for a loss in our society that people may not think is valuable, and when they don't think your form of grief is valuable, is when they don't count your form of, when they don't see your form of grief, when they don't acknowledge your form of grief and then punish you for it. So, for example, suffocated grief is when you are, again, if you, I think about also hospital settings when families show up. For example, underrepresented families or a large family, particularly underrepresented families, may show up at a hospital prior to COVID, that is, and then security is differentially called on underrepresented families, on Black families, on Latino families, right? When families are there because they tend to be more collectivist, and they want the pastor there and the cousin there, and much more communal. People in some hospital settings are threatened by that for whatever reason. I don't know why. Right? But are threatened and may be more likely to call security for a family that's simply grieving, right? They're somehow threatened by that. The same is the case we see with kids in school or college students, right? Who may miss an assignment in a class. And because they don't have a job right now because of COVID, and they're trying to work, I don't know, or they're worried about a grandparent, or they've dealt with a COVID death, or they aren't able to see their partner, and they miss an assignment because of all of the stress, or they're not sleeping. And if a professor says, well, you get an F, that student is penalized for a normal grief reaction of just being too tired to take the test, or not having access to a computer, right? And so suffocated grief is when you deal with some punishment that you should not be faced with, because you really do deserve the time, And your form of grief of feeling sad or distracted, having a hard time studying, should not be punished. So that's suffocated grief. So I guess I want to help you be able to identify when you know if you've dealt with suffocated grief is when you feel like you've been punished, right? Because you were sad or because you were angry. Again, the protest, a perfect example of that would be the people who at protests get tear gassed while they're walking down the street simply holding a sign, right? Not doing anything that's dangerous, but simply because some people don't agree with it or they're being told harm those people. We don't like that they're behaviorally grieving. We don't like that they're walking down the street trying to acknowledge the lost person.
Okay, and probably our.
So maybe she's also asking how does she know if she's grieving? I want to clarify that too. Just basic grief is first of all we have to pay attention to ourselves, right? Because we live in a culture that makes us that hasn't taught us to say the word grief, right? We know how to celebrate birthdays, and we say happy birthday. We know how to celebrate bar mitzvahs and when we turn 21, and marriages and weddings. We're taught to celebrate those. Our losses and our grief, not so much. I teach child development, and for example, in my child development classes, most textbooks focus on gains, right? What happens when you turn 2, all the things you can do. When you're 18, all the things you can do, right? But I focus though on what we lose then, right? Our 10-year-old in our house, when she turned 10, because we're so much into gains and losses, she's like, oh, Mom, I'm grieving. I'm in the double digits now. I will never be in the single digits again. So, one thing I want to encourage you all is to be able to name your experiences with loss. If you've had a breakup, right? COVID has challenged all of us. If you've ever had a breakup that, even if you initiated the breakup because you thought it was important, you still will grieve it, right? So grief is our reaction to separation distress, right? To separation from the person or thing that really mattered to us, that felt significant. We might grieve a sense of lack of safety. Parents grieve. There are a lot of parents who grieve their kids getting a driver's license, for example, in African American communities, because they really fear for their children's safety. They grieve in anticipation of what could happen to their child who is racially profiled while driving, right? And so people who have dealt with sexual assault and non-death loss may be grieving that. People who are dealing with COVID right now, or who are watching all of the environmental changes happen while doing their best to nurture the environment, may be grieving those losses. And again, if you're grieving, if you're experiencing things you don't typically experience, right? You have these headaches that are going on. Your stomach is growling like it did when you were anxious about something else. Are you sleeping more? Or are you just more exhausted than normal? Are you really having a difficult time focusing? Did you go to the store and buy something you shouldn't have, or make another huge decision that you think if you were not in that position that you would not have made? So it's tears, but it's also, are you angry today? Are you just pissed off? Are you really upset today?